Dark Souls 2 is undeniably the most contentious game among fans of the series, and one of the only games where I can't seem to make up my mind on whether or not I like it. There's a whole spectrum regarding players' opinions on the quality of the game, ranging from it's the best in the series to it's the worst game I've ever played. The most common opinion I found on the game concerning its quality is that Dark Souls 2 is a good game, just not a good Souls game, meaning that the game is good as a self-contained entity, but not when compared to the rest of the series. Today, I'm going to be taking a close look at every aspect of the game and comparing it to its predecessors. Here we go. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to be playing through the Scholar of the First Sin edition. Dark Souls 2 had a very troubled development cycle. As stated in the Design Works interview with the game's director Yui Tanimura, quote, "Yes, this game actually went through quite a troubled development process. Due to a number of factors, we were actually forced to rethink the entire game midway into development. We really had to go back to the drawing board and think once more about what a Dark Souls game should be," unquote. So it's obvious that the game suffered from shifting design priorities during development. The game also suffered from major graphical downgrades upon release. Early trailers show a very different looking game. The lighting system is what suffered the most, it seems. The game was going to be very, very dark, forcing you to either carry a torch with you or light sconces along the way. Traces of this mechanic can still be found in the main game in the very first area. These things can be found everywhere, but I never feel the need to light any of them. In Scholar of the First Sin, something actually happens when you light all the sconces in the tutorial area. But other than that, every single sconce in the game is pretty much useless. The game is well lit, and the only reason you would ever need to use a torch is if your brightness settings are low for some reason. The exception to this is the Gutter, No Man's Wharf, and Brightstone Cove Seldora, but I'll get to those later. For now, let's talk about the beginning of the game. A pre-rendered cutscene gives us the gist of our character's backstory. Our character is a roaming undead, trying to fight off the effects of the curse. They are slowly losing their memory and going insane. They come to an old woman's shack in the woods, and she tells our character about the kingdom of Drangleic, telling us that we will one day stand before its decrepit gate,
without really knowing why.
Our character goes to the ruins of Drangleic Castle and plunges themselves into a vortex of some sort. It's implied that it's sending us back in time before the kingdom's ruin, but certainly not before its downfall. Considering the time-related shenanigans later in the game, I wouldn't consider this theory far off. Nonetheless, our character finds themselves in Things Betwixt, which serves as a gateway between the outside world and the kingdom of Drangleic. I find it to be a strange decision to make the player a male with fixed features until they get to the Firekeeper's hut. This didn't have to be a problem. There could have been a character creation screen as soon as the cinematic was over, or maybe the game could disallow you to take off your outfit until after you've created your character. Overall, this has no substantial effect on the game, but it shows a lack of polish straight from the get-go. The field directly in front of where we spawn is filled with enemies that feel unfinished. Here and Aldia's Keep is the only place where you can find them, and I don't understand why they were put here at all. They aren't very aggressive, but if you attack them, they gang up on you. It's hard to see them with all the tall grass in the way. They can be ignored though, so whatever. We have an opportunity to fight an ogre, but without any weapons, it's kind of pointless. Finally, we arrive at Firekeeper's residence. Here we choose a class and fiddle with our appearance to our liking. And then we continue onwards. I'd like to talk about the tutorial areas of both Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2. In Dark Souls 1, the Undead Asylum teaches the player everything they need to know in a genius way. The player first learns that items come in the form of glowing lights on dead bodies, and that doors can be locked and will need a key to be opened. The player then learns the basic controls in a safe environment, and also learns that orange messages on the ground can be helpful. They reach their first bonfire and are introduced to the Asylum Demon. They learn that you will respawn at bonfires and you will lose your souls when you die. When they realize they have to run away from the Asylum Demon, they get their shield and weapon, and must equip it, familiarizing them with the UI in a safe environment. They continue forward and are halted by a boulder that rolls down some stairs, potentially knocking them down to where the shortcut door is. This teaches them a few things: that there are shortcuts, that you should be wary of your surroundings, and that some things are hidden. The player makes their way up and learns about parrying and plunging attacks, both of which are important skills to learn. Now let's talk about Dark Souls 2's tutorial. The nice thing about it is that it's entirely optional for the most part. There's one almost straight path which leads to Majula. This is good for returning players, but it also leads to the possibility of new players missing the entire thing. Funnily enough, Demon Souls had already had a solution to this problem in the form of letting players skip the tutorial altogether on their subsequent playthroughs. Why they don't do this in any of the other games, I don't know. Anyways, the main path splits into several isolated branches that gives you tips and little combat scenarios that test them in mostly safe environments. I think the real failure here is that there's no boss to test your skills at the end like in Dark Souls 1. I really think there should have been one. Other than that, the tutorial gets the job done, but it kind of breaks the rule of show, don't tell. Instead of forcing you to learn these things, you can just ignore all of it and be just fine. We are greeted by a gorgeous view and two paths. Going left will yield some healing items and an NPC to talk to, but not much else. Going right will bring us to the game's hub, Majula. In my opinion, the ultimate failure of Dark Souls 2 is its dismissal of the interconnected world of Dark Souls 1. Gone are the days where you would find a shortcut that would simply blow your mind straight open. A lot of the levels feel all too linear, without much to discover. I'm not nearly as familiar with Dark Souls 2's level design, because I only ever had to go in one direction once, maybe twice during the game. The level design of Dark Souls 1 has been burned into my memory. Every item, enemy, and minor detail can be recalled within a moment's notice. Dark Souls 2, on the other hand, well, it's a little fuzzy. Now, this can be viewed as either a good thing or a bad thing, but you have to admit that an element that made the game unique has been removed, for better or for worse, and in my honest opinion, for worse. Dark Souls 2 tries to compensate for this linearity by giving you a few more options concerning the direction you want to go at the beginning. The 4 big baddies, as far as I know, can be defeated in any order you choose. Ultimately though, it's meaningless because it gets really linear at the end no matter what you choose to do. Dark Souls 1 was masterclass at letting the player do all sorts of weird sequence breaks. The world is open to you from the moment you get to Firelink Shrine, and the world really feels open. You can have a ton of options, and although that may be difficult if you're underleveled, you can still do it. The game tries to maintain the non-linearity by allowing you to get the 4 lowered souls in any order you choose, but the quality of the game really drops off at that point. Again, Dark Souls 2 tries to emulate this by having many diverging paths from Majula, but, well, it feels arbitrary and forced. You're basically choosing which of 4 straight lines you want to go down first. The world feels less like a virtual world and more like a video game, complete with video gamey levels. And don't even get me started on that one elevator. You know the one I'm talking about. The locations have very little continuity in terms of physical location. You can download the Dark Souls 1 map and look around and everything makes sense. Download Dark Souls 2's map and... huh? No, that's not... what? They're in the same place? Huh? Despite it not interfering with gameplay, the world lacks authenticity, and you can feel that while playing the game. In Dark Souls 1, you would see locations you visit later in the game, like they were actually a part of the world, because they were. It all made sense. In Dark Souls 2, there's very few things like this. It's a shame, really. I'm not mad, just disappointed. Anyway, here we meet our main level up lady, the Emerald Herald. We also meet an armor vendor, blacksmith, and cute little kitty. Yes you are, yes you are. I don't mind having a more focused hub this time around. Almost every vendor you meet will end up here, and this makes you feel quite cozy by the end of the game. As I stated before, the path now diverges in multiple locations. On my first playthrough, as I'm sure many others did, I went to Hyde's Tower of Flame and killed the Dragon Rider, though the intended pathway for newcomers was almost certainly the Forest of Fallen Giants. The Forest of Fallen Giants is one of my favorite areas in the game. Most of the level revolves around a single bonfire, and the level spreads out from that point. There's multiple side paths you can traverse for some extra loot, and there are even multiple shortcuts. Being able to kill the pursuer early is a nice touch as well. If every level in the game was this polished, the game would be a masterpiece. Too bad a lot of the things I just listed are rare outside of this level. It's a shame. They obviously knew how to make a good level, but were either too lazy or too time constrained to do it. The boss of this area is mostly poop though. Looks like it too. I mean, I guess it's okay that the first boss isn't by any means the best one, nor is it very difficult, but they could have made a better first impression. Next up is Hyde's Tower of Flame. This area is garbage. All it is a collection of corridors suspended above water. The area itself is beautiful, but way too short, and the common enemy type infuriates me beyond words. The first boss of the area is a dude in armor swinging around a big weapon. A common criticism levied at the game, that I tend to agree with, is that there are too many dudes in armor swinging around big weapons. Now, don't get me wrong, dudes in armor can be awesome. I think the real problem here is that there are too many many dudes in armor that have predictable or boring movesets and lame backstories. I actually like the old Dragon Slayer boss fight, even if it is just a lazy attempt at fan service, because at least the dude in armor does something other than swing around a big weapon. It's Ornstein, and Ornstein has a cool backstory, uses something other than a sword or club-like weapon, and has unique moves. Dragon Rider is the opposite of this fight. He simply swings away at you with very similar moves that are super easy to dodge, and he practically has no interesting backstory. So, just to clarify, Dark Souls 2 doesn't have too many dudes in armor, just too many boring dudes in armor. I don't have much to say about No Man's Wharf. It's a pretty good area that utilizes the torch mechanic well. It even has a couple shortcuts, which is always nice. The Flexile Sentry is a decent fight, made unique by the fact it can switch movesets at any time, and the Rising Water is a nice touch as well, encouraging you to be more aggressive to kill them quickly. The Lost Bastille is a different story, however. The area itself looks very bland. It's mostly just square architecture, and the color palette is drab. The enemies are more generic soldiers and occasionally the slow lumbering brute. The Ruined Sentinels is actually a pretty interesting boss fight. It gives you time to analyze their moveset at the beginning with the first one, and then ramps up the difficulty by making you fight two of them at once. The Gargoyles, once again, are a different story. It seeks to both call back to and perhaps outdo the original Gargoyles, but between the bland visuals and lazy design, it's just another forgettable boss fight. They even took the music from the original Gargoyle fight and just put it here. Let's talk about music for a minute. I find the vast majority of this game's music to be totally forgettable. By no means am I implying that Dark Souls 1 soundtrack was a masterpiece, but at least I can tell you which boss music is which. In Dark Souls 2, I can't decide whether they repeat songs a lot or if they are really that similar to each other. I seriously couldn't tell you which song belongs to which boss even if you paid me to do it. For a game that uses music sparsely, you would think they'd put a little more life into it. Sinner's Rise puts you through a literal combat tunnel that never fails to annoy, and you're rewarded with fighting our first main boss, the Lost Sinner. The Lost Sinner isn't very good. It's another big guy swing sword fight, and that's it. But how does the lore on this character hold up? Good question. The Lost Sinner imprisoned herself to make her suffer for her sins. That's it. Oh, okay. Yeah, I can really see why this is one of the main 4 bosses. Great, fantastic, let's move on. Next up is Huntsman's Cops. The area looks nice, it has good atmosphere, the lore behind it is interesting as well. It has plenty of side content with good loot, and the Executioner's Chariot boss fight is one of the more unique fights in the game. Unlike the level, the main boss here is absolute garbage. The Skeleton Lords is, in essence, a mob of regular enemies disguised as a boss fight. I would have preferred if they had at least made the Skeleton Lords themselves actually a challenge to deal with, but they're only a little bit more powerful than a regular enemy. In short, lazy. Harvest Valley is the poison level, because this is a Souls game, and so we needed a poison level. In terms of poisonous areas in Souls games, Harvest Valley at least distinguishes itself visually and with its enemy types. However, the enemy placement feels a bit spammy in some places, and although the level design fans out into multiple paths, it still lacks what made Dark Souls 1's levels so special. It's the same with the boss, the Covetous Demon. The fight is way too easy, and it kinda just flops around a lot. It would need at least twice as much health to pose any kind of a challenge to a veteran. Earthen Peak uses its verticality well as you ascend the tower. I don't have a lot to say about it. It's a decent level, and mostly just a continuation of Harvest Valley. The boss of the area has a unique mechanic where it heals itself while standing in poison, and if you didn't drain the poison beforehand, it can be a real problem. The boss design is lazy, its moveset is way too predictable, but at least it did something right. Uh-oh. Do you feel it? It's elevator time. Everyone's favorite part, the nonsensical magic elevator that goes upward but somehow drops us off at a castle that's been sunk into a lake of lava. Yeah, okay. This further illustrates my point about how the world doesn't feel authentic. Nothing really fits together. I'm aware that this game takes place in a world where time is literally falling apart, but that never stopped the rules of physics from working. It probably has something to do with cut content, as the elevator is clearly meant to be inside the mountain behind Earthen Peak, but the area between them must have been cut, so they just put the elevator on the top of Earthen Peak. Have I said Earthen Peak enough times? Iron Keep is a fairly infuriating area. The level design is, once again, boxy. It lacks visual flair, despite its generic lava castle appearance. The difficulty here dramatically spikes. There are so many enemies in this area that I can't help but try to run through it all, except there are certain choke points that are clearly meant to discourage this. In fact, let's play a game. The game is called How Many Alone Nights Do I Have to Kill Just to Be Alone for 2 minutes? Let's find out! The first boss in this area, Smelter Demon, is quite simply the best boss in Dark Souls 2. It's also the hardest one. Yes, he's a dude in armor swinging around a big weapon, but he's more than that. He has extra fire-related moves, and his fight has the added challenge of having to keep track of your health at all times because you take damage when you're near him. Overall, a great boss fight. Seriously, this guy should have been the Old Iron King. Speaking of the Old Iron King, let's talk about him. I don't think a more generic monster has ever been designed. He's basically a mix between the Balrog from Lord of the Rings and Diablo from, well, Diablo. The fight itself is sleep-inducing as you hit his fists over and over, avoiding his, 4 moves. His presentation may be, as the kids say, epic, but he's nothing to gawk at. With him dead, 2 of our main bosses have been defeated. After killing the Old Iron King, I literally forgot which boss came next. I legitimately had to think for a minute or two before it finally clicked and I thought, oh yeah, the Big Spider. And so to the Big Spider we shall go. First we'll need to go through the Shaded Woods, an area with a lot of potential, but mostly squandered potential. I think it's a cool idea to block progression using statues that must be transformed using fragrant branches, kind of like complex keys for complex locks. Now, in Shaded Woods proper, there are plenty of opportunities to use fragrant branches, but I can never find enough of the branches to actually justify wasting them on random things when they are required to make actual progress. I suppose you could argue that it's meant to be New Game Plus content. We come to the fork in the road, but only one path is relevant to us at the moment. This area is very interesting. On a first playthrough, it can really feel like you're lost in the woods, being assaulted by ghosts from every angle. On repeat playthroughs though, you can really just make a beeline for the exit. I think that the entire area should have been covered in mist, or at least utilize the mist for something other than a unique set piece. Maybe there's an item you have to find somewhere deep in the misted forest. I don't know. I just feel like they kind of had a cool idea here, but didn't quite make good on it. The spooky jars are a cool idea as well, but again, they didn't quite make good on it. The entire area can essentially be skipped by just running towards the boss. Getting cursed in Dark Souls 2 isn't nearly as troublesome as in Dark Souls 1. Instead, that itch has been scratched by the petrification status. I think it would have been better if the jars petrified you instead of cursing you, but hey, whatever. There's an NPC in this area that can be talked to only if you have a special ring equipped, which then allows you to summon him for the boss fight. This is a cool idea and it's well executed. The boss is clearly just ripping off Quelaag from the first game, not a very entertaining fight. The next area is Doors of Pharos. This area is unique because of its relationship to the Rat Covenant. Other players can summon you into their world at random, and then can use traps they've set up to kill you. Personally, this has only happened to me once, and it wasn't very interesting. I'm sure this area was a whole lot more fun when the game's community was active, but as it stands now, pretty boring. Brightstone Cove Seldora is our next stop, and it has more going for it. The military camp is a fun little side area filled with undead soldiers, making you wonder just what they were doing here before they turned undead. Further ahead is some boulder traps that can either assist you or be a burden. The first big boss of this area is a joke. Again, it's just a mob of enemies disguised as a boss. You know, Dark Souls 2 has a lot of bosses. Dark Souls 1 had 22. Dark Souls 2, including the DLC, has 41. 41 bosses is a lot of bosses. Now, think to yourself, how many bosses are actually good? I looked at the list of all the bosses, and I only counted 20 of them that I would actually consider well designed. That is pitiful. Dark Souls 2 may be bigger than Dark Souls 1, But always remember, bigger doesn't always mean better. Continuing onward, we reach the lower part of Saldora, filled with mages and spiders. I like this area because of its use of the torch. The spiders here will remain docile as long as you have a torch in your hand. I also like how you descend these huge spider webs, building up to the boss, although it's kind of easy to guess what the boss is going to be. The Duke's Dear Freya is a fun boss in my opinion. As long as you have a torch lit, the little spiders won't bother you, but it also means you can't use a shield. You have to hit Freya's head to do any damage, but luckily she has 2. This is probably my favorite boss fight out of the 4 Great Soul bosses. With 3 of the 4 Great Souls embraced, there is only one way to go, to the gutter. There are 2 ways to get to the gutter. Either buy an expensive ladder or let gravity be your guide, which requires an expensive ring. The ladder is more convenient, but you'll miss out on some items. The gutter certainly gives off the impression that it's been long forgotten, filled with mindless undead and foul creatures. The torch is used in this area to light your way, marking the places where you've already been, which is useful because everything looks very similar. Once we've gone down even further, we reach Black Gulch, which is a very small area, but still oh so frustrating. Despite the fact that you get invaded by NPCs twice, there are poison-spitting statues right in front of the boss gate, which means that you're going to get poisoned about 50% of the time while entering, which is just plain cheap. Speaking of the boss, the Rotten is probably one of the most boring bosses in the game. Surprise, surprise, another big thing that predictably swings at you over and over until you kill it. The design itself is boring as well. Despite his grotesque appearance, he's really just a big turd. With that disappointing fight out of the way, it's time to make our way to Drangley Castle, since our goal is to seek the king. At this point, the game feels like it's wrapping up, but in reality, we're only about halfway through. I'll talk more on this later. We pass through the Shrine of Winter and reach the castle. Here we meet the Emerald Herald, giving us some insight into our goal. 2 elephants guard the bridge. 1 elephant is messed up enough, but 2 of them in a tight space is overkill. Dark Souls 2 is especially fond of throwing hordes of enemies at you to deal with at once. In Dark Souls 1, this was almost never a problem because enemies could be killed individually despite there being multiple of them. Here, however, the designers were perfectly content with giving you large groups of enemies to fight, and it never feels quite fair. An enemy must be killed next to a large golem statue to open the gate, which I suppose is why a whole entourage of soldiers greets you. The castle itself is full of knights and living statues, and loves to throw many of them at you at once. The visuals aren't very inspiring, and the level design itself leaves something to be desired, but overall, not a bad level. Mere Knight is a dude in armor swinging around a big weapon, but I like this fight because the visuals are imposing, and his use of his shield and lightning powers makes him unique. As it turns out, Vendrick is in the undead Crypt, but we first have to go through the Shrine of Amana. This is everyone's least favorite part of the game, and I'd have to agree. The water slows you down, whatever these things are attack from the water, and magic users are pelting you constantly. The end of the first area is guarded by a nearly impassable wall of clerics. This level teeters on the edge of being totally unfair, and the second half of the level isn't any better. For one, a magic-using NPC invades, which doesn't help the fact that you're already being assaulted by other magic users. The Demon of Song is a fun boss fight, even if the only reason it's fun is because of how cool the design is. It reminds me of something that would be in Dark Souls 1, and that's always a good thing. The Undead Crypt is a unique level in that 1. You aren't allowed to use a torch, 2. Ghosts are constantly being summoned by breakable tombstones, and 3. Hollows will ring bells that awaken the ghosts. This area is really enjoyable, and even has a cool shortcut from the beginning of the level to the end. It's a shame that it's dragged down because of the horrible run to the boss. The boss fog is being guarded by a frankly ridiculous number of tough enemies, and even more enemies can be summoned by a bell-ringing hollow. Running past them all is a wildly inconsistent solution, but even that is better than actually trying to fight all of them. Velstadt is the boss, and while he may be yet another dude in armor, I think he's a solid fight. His armor and weapon look awesome, his moveset is fairly diverse, and he uses dark magic. A tough fight, fight, and a good one too. With the royal aegis out of the way, we finally come face to face with King Vendrick, the man we've heard so much about. It's a jarring moment when you find out he's turned completely hollow and doesn't even acknowledge your presence. We pick up his ring, which opens various doors around the world, and we continue on our way. It's at this point that the game starts to drag on. There's still quite a bit left, even though the game seemed to be building up the hype for King Vendrick as the final boss. Obviously, this was intended, but I still get the feeling that the game should have been a bit shorter. Once again, bigger doesn't always mean better. At this point, the Throne of Want is accessible, but we don't have the means to acquire it just yet, and so we go to Alby's Keep. A quick nitpick on the King's doors is that they take a super long time to open, and they don't even stay open. This may have been to stop you from running past the ogre on the way to Alby's Keep, but it gets annoying if you have to open the doors multiple times, as with the gate blocking the path to the Throne of Want. Alby's Keep is a visually interesting, if straightforward level. It houses an NPC with an interesting quest, enemies that break through mirrors to attack you, a giant basilisk, which is probably easier to kill than the regular ones, and way too many ogres. The boss, Guardian Dragon, is a cool but ultimately disappointing fight. It comes off as more of a mini-boss than a real attempt to make a memorable dragon fight, such as with Calamite or Sin. Luckily, the area afterwards makes up for it. We're greeted with a breathtaking view and a long elevator ride to enjoy it. The dragon area is by far the most visually impressive area of the game, excluding the DLC. In fact, I would consider it the only visually impressive area of the game. Most of the areas in Dark Souls 2 have drab color palettes, flat textures, and boring art design. They failed to capture the attention to detail that is prevalent in the first game entirely. In Dark Souls 1, I would often look at the gorgeous vistas for minutes at a time. Even now, after I've played the game many times, I still take the time to appreciate how good the skyboxes look. This never happened for me in Dark Souls 2, except for the dragon area. It's the only level that really captures your imagination and makes you excited to explore it all. The first part of the level is made up of rocky plateaus and rickety bridges infested with more dragons and the exploding enemies from earlier. It's worth exploring because of the sheer amount of upgrade materials you find along the way, as well as the visuals. The second half of the level is a cool gauntlet with combat encounters. You're pitted against beefed up versions of the knights you found at Hyde's Tower at the beginning of the game. The dragon knights will bow to you and respectfully watch you kill them, and won't get involved unless you chicken out and run away from the fight, in which case they'll all try to murder you. It's nice to have an area where the enemies are civilized and not explicitly hostile. The final challenge is a super version of the regular dragon knights, which can be a real pain in the butt. Up at the top, you'll find the ancient dragon who gives you a key which allows you to visit the memories of dead giants scattered in the forest. It's cool that the game allows you to actually see how the kingdom was destroyed, and even participate. You can even enter the memory of an ancient dragon, and see the world when it was nothing more than grey crags and arch trees. It's too bad that their potential is squandered due to their arbitrary time limit and generally boring design. It would have been a real treat if this part of the game had been fleshed out more. Anyways, the Giant Lord is literally the last giant except with a real weapon, and he isn't much more difficult either. With him killed, we can finally fight the two final bosses. We speak to the Emerald Herald one more time, and then we make the long walk to the throne. The Throne Watcher and Defender is probably one of my favorite fights, because it requires that you juggle two opponents at once, one of them fast and springy, the other slow and lumbering. But this time you have to kill them simultaneously rather than one at a time. It of course comes nowhere close to the mastery of the Ornstein and Smo fight. Their designs are uninspired and their moveset once again is super boring, but it's a worthy boss nonetheless. The same cannot be said about the final boss, Nashandra. Her music is boring, her design is cliche, and she's really easy. There are many things that a final boss in a Dark Souls game should be, but sleep-inducing is not one of them. Generic may as well be written all over her body, and she ends up leaving a sour taste in my mouth. The ending is basically the same as the first Dark Souls, but I think that's alright because the entire point of the story is that history is locked in an everlasting cycle from which it can't ever escape, and with that comes the end of the second Dark Souls. My thoughts and feelings about this game are as conflicted as ever. There's no doubt that Dark Souls 2 is a good game, but does it deserve to be called a good Souls game? The first game had such majesty in its art design and world structure. Everything looked like it had loving attention poured into it, except of course for a couple of the later levels. Dark Souls 2 on the other hand is absolutely bipolar in terms of its quality. Some areas are great, others are the worst. Sometimes the game is beautiful, other times it looks like garbage. There were times in my most recent playthrough that I wondered why I still play this game so many times, even though there are parts of it that I hate. There were also times that I asked myself why I don't play it more often, even though there are parts that I love. I went into this critique expecting that I would be a lot more harsh on the game, but left with my feelings all mixed around because of how much I truly enjoyed it. If there's one word I would use to describe Dark Souls 2, it would be unpolished. It's clear through every facet of the game that the developers wanted to to make something special, but didn't have the time, resources, or management that it needed. Dark Souls 2 is not a lazy sequel. Its lore is fantastic, there are very few reused assets, and the gameplay has been furthered considerably. The developers had a lot of cool ideas, but once again they feel unpolished. So to answer my own question, is Dark Souls 2 a good Souls game? I'm gonna have to give that one a no. But is Dark Souls 2 a good game? Yes. Definitely. I'll make a video covering the DLC areas of the game in the future. Leave this video with whatever message you've gained from watching it. I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it. I wouldn't expect videos this long from me very often. This is kind of a special occasion. Please leave any feedback you'd like to in the comments, and I'll respond. Like the video and subscribe if you want to see more. I'm Jabik, and may we meet again.